What's up, horror fans? Pete here from the Lassercast. There you go. I always have two shows, so it's hard to remember which one we're doing. And it's especially hard to remember what we're doing because I don't know if this is necessarily a horror movie we're talking about today. Today, we are talking about 1982's Blade Runner. And if we're being real specific, we're actually talking about 2007's version of Blade Runner, which is called The Final Cut, which Danny just saw for the first time this week. So,
first
Danny,
time straight through.
First time straight through. Yes. So, Danny, I know that you've had a little bit of difficulty watching Blade Runner before. Has it always been this cut that you've tried, or have you tried other versions of it?
I think obviously the first time I tried watching Blade Runner, it was probably the original.
Yeah.
I do remember watching a version that had Harrison Ford narrating at the end, which I know is not the chosen cut.
Yeah.
I remember in 2007 when the final cut came out. Now, this is going back now 17 years.
Exactly.
I think they put this out into theaters, and I went to see it with a few friends in the city. And as typically happens with me in Blade Runner, I fell asleep in the movie theater.
Yeah.
And I missed at least 10 minutes of the movie. So when I say I've never watched this movie straight through, up until Wednesday night or Tuesday night, I had never sat through Blade Runner in one sitting. I had only watched it in pieces, either on a VHS tape, on TV, or in the movie theater. And I've fallen asleep in the middle of it several times. I've picked up the next morning. I've made up for those chunks in the next viewing, but it took until my 42nd year of life to watch this 42-year-old movie straight through. And I'm glad I did. I also got perfectly. The weather in New York City has been brutal the last week. It has been nonstop rain. Last night we had the remnants of Hurricane Debbie were blowing through, so it was high winds last night as well. And I saw this Tuesday night in a blistering rainstorm. I don't take umbrellas with me that often, but I had an umbrella with me to get to and from my car at the Nighthawk Cinema I was at. And I also want to shout out that the person who introduced the movie is the author, Chris Nashawati, whose new book is called The Future Was Now, Mad Men, Mavericks, and the Epic Sci-Fi Summer of 1982.
Nice.
This book is so much fun. As many of you know, if you listen to me, I've been reading almost exclusively via Audible since the pandemic.
Yeah.
I'm 100 pages on paper through this book in just a couple of days. And it's all about the summer of 1982 when 8 science fiction blockbusters, including, of course, Blade Runner, came out in the movie theater in a 2-month span. And Blade Runner and The Thing both came out on the same day and were both critically panned and were effectively box office flops that needed to be rescued by our generation on VHS. And they were given second lives on VHS, and the greater love and appreciation has really come from the people who got to see those movies later, probably in the mid to late 80s and maybe even early 90s.
Well, everything you just said is true, but in my personal experience, it doesn't seem like there is the love for Blade Runner, at least from the people that I know. I've talked to a couple of people about Blade Runner because you mentioned we should record it because you saw this guy. And so, I talked to Brian. I still don't know if Brian likes it or not. He just said that he has a copy of it on Blu-ray. I talked to my wife and I talked to another guy. I don't know if he wants me saying this on our recording or not, but a guy who's been on our show a couple of times. And everyone seems to not like Blade Runner. And I know that you posted a thing on Facebook where you were saying that it has these really iconic moments. You can tell that it influenced other movies, but a lot of people seem to think that this movie's kind of slow. My wife wasn't a big fan of Blade Runner 2049 either. She thought there was like good moments in that as well, but she thought that kind of dragged. And I find that I'm the only person that legitimately likes this movie for what it is. Yeah, go ahead.
It's really interesting because I always grew up, and my relationship with this movie always made me feel like an outsider, that, oh my God, I'm the one guy who can't stay awake through this epic sci-fi masterpiece that everyone loves.
Yeah.
And then in this last week, since I posted that I was going to see it in the theater, and since I've started reading this book, and I've been talking to a lot of people, both in the theater and on social media, I have noticed that I'm not alone, and that there are a lot of people who have I don't want to say a love-hate, but just a weird relationship with this movie. My experience with this movie has always been, I'm capable of acknowledging that it is an insanely influential science fiction film.
Sure.
Maybe one of the most influential science fiction movies. Watching it Tuesday night, there's like a checklist in my head of movies where I'm like, oh, well, that took inspiration from this borrowed from this movie borrowed from Blade Runner. And I'm like checking off in my head all these movies that I can tell, from the visual style to the characters to the just the way everything seems, they borrowed from this movie.
Yeah. Well,
and I think that critically, sometimes we can't separate what's an influential movie from what's a truly great movie. I don't think Blade Runner is a great movie. I like it more now, having watched it finally straight through in the cut that Ridley Scott has said is his chosen cut.
Yeah.
Well, I still don't think it's a great movie. I think it's a very good, very flawed movie.
Okay. It's interesting though, because like you talked about The Thing, and you said that like everyone loves The Thing, and both were panned when they came out and sort of overlooked. In general, like The Thing is like Jaws, where people refer back to it and they treat it like it's like this iconic movie. Blade Runner, I understand, like it's not for everyone. I think, there's a little bit of nostalgia for me because I remember seeing certain scenes, and a lot of times, like, and I've said this on the show many times before, that like I've seen movies as like snippets on HBO before I've seen like the whole thing in one piece, just like you with your experience. And when you see this kind of stuff as a kid, it's almost like when you find like porn and stuff. Like one of the things that kids these days won't understand is that like when you were a kid, sometimes you would find porn like in the woods or some random spot. There wasn't this readily accessible thing that was like on your phone or, on the internet. And so it was almost like this mind-blowing thing, especially if like you're like pre-puberty, you're like, what is this? And that's kind of what Blade Runner was like for me as a kid. And so I had to, as I was watching this just recently, I had to think, okay, if I was watching this cold for the first time now, and I'd never seen it before, would I enjoy this movie? And I would say, yes, I would. Now, I got down here this ticker that says Ridley Scott as a director. And my wife was saying that she actually doesn't really like Ridley Scott as a director. She likes Thelma and Louise. She likes Gladiator. But in general, she finds his movies to be kind of cold and lifeless. And then I talked to another friend. I don't know if I can name him or not, but he was saying that he felt like Ridley Scott has this amazing eye, but there's not much depth to his work. And what I really liked about what he said there was that he read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the source material for this movie. And he said that story in itself is this like existential, interesting story that's like real deep and, questions reality and perception. And that Ridley Scott essentially turned this movie, this adaptation of it, of Director Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, into this like futuristic noir movie versus this like sort of like deep kind of thing. And he said that Alien, just my last point before I stop, he said that Alien is actually like the perfect movie for Ridley Scott because there's not much to it. And so my last point I want to make is that um, sometimes I think that style and the way that a movie is made can be just as valuable or just as powerful as like, oh, this has got this real engaging story. This has got this real, like, oh, the characters are so entertaining. I personally think that there's some real interesting characters and there's some incredible performances in this movie. I don't know if Harrison Ford's character is that interesting or his performance is that great.
Yeah.
But I would say the replicants are pretty fucking phenomenal. All of them.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring up, just to piggyback on some of the things you said. This movie reminds me in many ways of two other science fiction movies. One of them, and I think both of them are fairly obvious when I mention them, 2001, in the sense that it's this like grand in scope science fiction movie that a lot of people struggle with because of pacing, because of, in many, especially 2001, there's a lack of characters for long periods of the movie. But the other movie is Alien, which Ridley Scott directed.
Right.
A lot of people, when they do their Alien ranking, put Aliens by James Cameron above Alien. Why? There's more characters. They're saying fun dialogue. They're shooting their guns. They're space marines. They're doing cool shit. Whereas Alien is this slow, methodical, haunted house movie in space that happens to have one of the greatest movie monsters of all time hunting down this cast.
Right.
But what I love about Alien versus Blade Runner is because you're in a spaceship, there's a limited place where people can go. And so the characters are never off screen for too long. In Blade Runner, and you kind of hinted at this, there are really interesting characters that are on screen and then disappear for 40 to 50 minutes at a time. And then we're stuck following what is probably the blandest Harrison Ford performance of that. This is a guy who was in the middle in 1982 of playing Indiana Jones and Han Solo.
Right.
And in Blade Runner, he is monotone. He has very little personality. He maybe rapes a robot at one point. I'm still unsure of the whole romance thing with Rachel, Sean Young's character, that still, even watching it a couple nights ago, kind of creeps me out.
Yeah.
And he is, for lack of a better, he's the protagonist.
Yeah.
And there are other characters in this movie that I'm so much more interested in. Tyrell, played by my almost namesake, Joe Turkel, who was also Grady in The Shining. There's William Sanderson's character of who's he played? Jefferson, right?
William Sanderson. Oh, J.F. Sebastian.
Oh, Sebastian. JF is the JF Sebastian. He plays Sebastian.
Yeah.
He's an incredibly interesting character who I love watching on screen. And then, of course, you have the replicants, Rutger Hauer's Roy Beatty and Daryl Hannah's Pris. Even Brian, what's his last name? Brian Jones?
Brian James.
Brian James, who's only in the movie for a couple of scenes as Leon. Those characters are so much more engaging. Joanna Cassidy has one scene in the movie, and it's electric. Zora? And and it's great. And then, okay, she gets killed off. Okay, now I'm back with Harrison Ford. And the movie, again, for me, where this movie succeeds and where it becomes iconic, the visual style, the matte paintings that are used for the background, just the way the city is designed. I don't know. Is it cyberpunk? Is it like futuristic? I don't know how to describe it, but like,
yeah, a lot of people would credit this as the origin of cyberpunk. Like it's this movie.
I love the aesthetic of this movie.
Yeah.
I just wish that there was more meat on the bones. And then it's like you get this villain, Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer, who is so freaking good, but he's pigeonholed into effectively 2 or 3 scenes in the movie.
Yeah.
And for most of the final act, he is just being like a run and chase bad guy.
Yeah.
Instead of, doing what we, the replicants in this movie are facing their own existential crisis.
Right.
And it's a crisis that I don't think Ridley Scott really lets develop. You know, everybody talks forever about Rutger Hauer, Roy Batty's monologue at the end.
Yes.
It's good.
Uh-oh, I'm getting worried.
No. It's 3 lines. Okay? So it's barely a monologue. It's here. So in the book, The Future Was Now, he opens the book with that quote. Here's the entire quote. Okay? I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched C-beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All these moments will be lost in time, like tears in the rain. Time to die. That's it. That's how much of the page it takes up. So don't tell me this is this iconic monologue when it's effectively 3 lines of great dialogue. But like when I think of iconic monologues, you brought up Jaws earlier. I think of Robert Shaw doing the Indianapolis monologue on the boat. And that identifies this character and sets up the entire final act of the movie for that character. You fully understand who Quint is, and he commands the screen for minutes and minutes at a time. Yeah. And the best 2 scenes that we get with Roy are the scene with Tyrell, which doesn't last long enough for me, and then the ending where he effectively just chases Harrison Ford for 10 minutes along a rooftop and then kneels down, delivers this really great 3 to 4 lines of dialogue and dies. And so like my biggest problems with this movie, visually stunning, the score awesome, the way it was made with the matte paintings and the miniatures, just fantastic. Like they don't make movies like that anymore.
Yeah.
The characters are great,
right,
but they are not on screen long enough for me. I'm a guy who loves characters and dialogue. This movie could have been no action at all.
Yeah.
The entire final scene of this movie, instead of a fight on the rooftop, could have been Harrison Ford catching up to Roy and having Roy monologue for 10 full minutes.
Yeah.
And I would have loved it. And so that's where my criticisms come from with this movie, is that you mentioned that people think it's slow. I don't think that's controversial. It is. It's very slow because you're waiting sometimes 45 minutes at a time for these characters that you're interested in to come back. And then the movie will drop like a James Hong on you in that one scene where he's like the eyeball guy. And you're like, oh, I want to know more about him. Nope, one scene. That's all you get. Joanna Cassidy, the snake lady. And Harrison Ford actually showing personality in that scene. Like it's Raiders.
He's the inspector.
Like it's Last Crusade, and he's there to inspect the tapestries.
Yeah.
And that's one scene, and then Joanna Cassidy's character gets blown away, and you're like, all right, that's the end of that. I guess You know, now
Yeah.
it's so I have a complicated relationship with this movie.
Yeah.
I admire it. I respect it for what it has done to movies and science fiction going forward. I just can't bring myself to say I love this movie. Like, I would rather put on 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is nearly 30 to 45 minutes longer,
Yeah.
than put on Blade Runner. Um, if I had to watch one of those movies right now.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, shit. How do I respond to that? It's interesting because some of the things that you've said today so far, like you're saying that like people rank Aliens higher because it has like a bigger cast and maybe more quotable dialogue. Um, and then you were saying that like the length of Roy Batty's monologue is very short, considering how much people rave about it, right? And so it kind of makes me think, is the quality of a movie based upon the ratio of like good scenes or good moments versus the length of the movie, right? And so I think that like some people would say that like you just said, that like Blade Runner has this long run time, but it only has these sort of like sharp, awesome moments spread throughout, and maybe it's too thin, too thinly spread. It's funny because there's this one line that Tyrell says to Roy Batty when he sees him, when he's talking about his own mortality, and he's saying, the candle that burns brightest burns twice as short, or something like that. I might be misquoting it, but that's the sentiment. And there's these sort of like really bright flash moments throughout this movie. But for me, when I rewatch this movie, I always kind of use the same litmus test I always use for every movie that I really enjoy, where I'm like, okay, am I excited about the upcoming scene? Am I excited like, oh, it's this scene. I can't wait till this scene happens. And, in my very favorite movies, like every scene is that scene, right? For this, I do find myself kind of almost checking out when it's Deckard and Rachel, right, together. Like a lot of their interactions, I kind of find myself checking out. Then like when they're flying in the car, I think it's amazing. And when I think about like what movies looked like in 1982 and then this moment, I think it's like the only thing that's even comparable is like maybe Avatar in 3D, where it's just like that big of a difference between what we're seeing. You're like, whoa, movies can fucking look like this. But still, it seems like extra long, right? Even the intro. But the thing is that like for me, all of these sequences are amazing. And I think that a big part of it has to do with the Vangelis soundtrack, right? I've kind of said how people are critical of Ridley Scott and they're not as impressed with him. But for me, Ridley Scott, I think that like his his way that he gets everyone to make his movies, from the production staff to the soundtrack to the acting, the way that he's able to bring it together like a general and make this fucking image, this iconic image. I feel like he delivers maybe more than any other director that I know of like tying it all together. But I will give everyone the concession that like it doesn't necessarily have that heart that people are looking for, that quotability. I will say for this movie, there's a lot of really fucking quotable lines in this movie. More human than human. There's the monologue you mentioned. There's a ton. It's a pity that she's not going to live. But then again, who really does? There's so many lines in this movie that
Is there anybody more snake-like in the world than Edward James Olmos in this movie?
Right. And like that's the thing, right? Because okay, one thing I want to also bring up too is one thing that is like me beating a dead horse. I'm a broken record, but you know that I hate exposition dumps, and I love when it's like the movie's just fucking telling you something through images or just through the acting, right? The performances. And I feel like this version of Blade Runner does that, where there's like stuff that they imply, but it's not stuff that's being told to you right away. Like Edward James Olmos is origami at the very end of the movie, and Harrison Ford finds it. I'm not sure because I haven't seen the original cut in a very long time, but I'm not sure if there's that voiceover of him saying that when Harrison Ford picks up the origami. I feel like if there isn't, that makes it even better, right? But one cardinal sin, one horrible thing about the original version, what maybe people would consider to be the real movie, is that there's this fucking narration by Deckard throughout the whole movie. And Harrison Ford hated it. And I think that if that was the version of Blade Runner that I watched all the time and I'd never seen any other versions, I'd be like, oh, this is lame. You know?
It's so I actually asked a friend of mine when we walked out of the movie theater and we were in the car, and I was like, when did the whole Deckard is a replicant thing begin? And because again, like I was not a fan of this movie as a child, so I don't remember. And I remember that that's like this big debate amongst fans of the movie is Deckard a replicant? And the only hints that you get is there's a line from Rachel who says, "Have you ever taken this test yourself?"
Right.
And then there's also, of course, there's the in this cut. There's the unicorn dream.
Yes.
And then there's Edward James Olmos's unicorn origami.
Yes.
How would he have known about that unless they know what they implanted? So it's leaving that up to the viewer to analyze, to discuss, to think about, which is something I do really like.
Yeah.
It's just interesting that I think it was the final cut that really amplified that whole Deckard a replicant debate. You have on the bottom of the screen here, Dangerous Days, the Making of Blade Runner. I'm going to assume that is a documentary.
It is.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. My standpoint would be I would much sooner, and by sooner I mean like as soon as we're done recording, go watch that than rewatch Blade Runner. And I feel like a documentary about the making of this movie would be so much more fascinating than sitting through the 2-hour runtime of Blade Runner. And I think that there are a lot of movies like that. There's movies that the behind the scenes is just fucking fascinating. Like we've reviewed documentaries about the making of Alien, documentaries, about the makings of other films. I just rewatched a documentary called Family Portrait. We've been covering Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. About what it was like making the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Right. My father, for years, used to tell me that Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse made by Francis Ford Coppola's daughter about the making of Apocalypse Now, was better than Apocalypse Now because of seeing all of the nightmare production that Apocalypse Now was. So I would be super interested in checking this out. I don't know if it's streaming, if it was like a Blu-ray exclusive.
Yeah, it was maybe
it's on YouTube.
Yeah. It was on the DVD for the movie, and I remember watching that like years ago. It's on YouTube, but it's like broken down in installments, and I don't know how like great they are, the quality and stuff. I think that if you go on Amazon, Prime, you can just rent it for like $3.99 if you want to spare the money. I highly recommend it. I'm pretty sure that it's made by the people that made the making of documentary that's on Alien, on the Alien DVD as well, and that's a fucking phenomenal documentary too. In both of those documentaries, they go into detail about Ridley Scott and how I think the word that I always think of when I think of Ridley Scott is like uncompromising. I think that like people get really frustrated working with Ridley Scott. Harrison Ford, notoriously for this movie, like really hated Ridley Scott. I think people on the set for this movie, sometimes I get them mixed up with Alien, but I think people on the set for this movie had like t-shirts made where they were like the staff were like making fun of Ridley Scott on the t-shirts because they like hated him so much. And I think that like he wants to make things a certain way, and sometimes it makes things extremely difficult for the rest of the film crew, but he's just like, fuck it, this is my vision. And the movie's called Dangerous Days. I always think that it's called Dark Days for some reason. I'm like, oh, that's right, it's Dangerous Days. because the filming of this movie was just a fucking nightmare, and it was dark all the time, just like it's dark in this movie. It's like dark and raining. They're on these sets where everything is like closed off and it's dark, and they're just dumping water on people the whole time.
I said one movie that the first movie that I thought of that borrowed from this, and it has nothing to do with science fiction, but it had to do with the rain, and it was Seven. The idea of like this city hellscape, where like Morgan Freeman has like long lines of dialogue about what a shithole city they live in,
right?
And on top of that, it never stops raining. It is pouring every minute you're outside until, ironically, like the last part of the movie when they're out in the like desert heat getting Gwyneth Paltrow's head. So
spoilers.
Yeah, spoiler for a movie that came out in 1995. Sorry.
Yeah. But I was gonna if we're gonna list, right? Because you said in your little Facebook post that this movie's so influential. But I mean, I can think off just the top of my head, based on this subject alone, movies that I think wouldn't exist or owe a lot of their DNA to this movie. Genre films like The Crow, The Matrix, Dark City,
of course.
Dark City.
City, of course. Yeah.
And there's something to be said about all of those movies. I think The Matrix, above the rest of them, The Matrix has like the most heart and the most like, just it like draws you in. It's the most engaging out of all of those movies. But if we think of movies as like art, I know we always want to focus on the story and the characters, and of course that's the crucial thing. That's what makes us come back to movies. But if we think of it as like art, there's so much in Blade Runner that is like art that Ridley Scott put together. Like things that like blow my mind. Like I love like I could just discuss like a single fucking scene and talk about how beautiful it looks. The lighting is incredible. Then the acting is amazing. And then the music tying it all together, it just makes this fucking perfect meal, right? Like with Roy Batty talking to Tyrell, their interaction back and forth between each other, the concept of like, he's essentially meeting his God, and God's telling him, you're special, but you're going to die. That's your flaw. And then him just fucking crushing God's head in his hand, and the noise that he fucking makes, and like cutting off to JF Sebastian, like watching and kind of crying and being scared. And it's just such a fucking amazing scene with like the music going. And then, you feel so sad because you like JF Sebastian just because of the way the actor plays him. And then Roy Batty's walking after him and he's like calling after him. And you don't see it in this cut of what happens to him, but that he dies based on a police report later. Then we cut to Rutger Hauer like in an elevator going down, and he just kind of has this look on his face, like he's like, what did I just do? Or he's like kind of invigorated, and he looks down, and the music is just so fucking good. And I feel like there's a lot of that in this movie.
Oh yeah. I mean, you brought up like the art, I also thought about just when like Deckard goes out and looks down and you see like the flying cars and how tall the city is. That reminded me, like, that is every Star Wars movie since the prequels, the sequels. There's always scenes of like these infinitely tall cities that go on forever and ever. And you fly and you have the flying cars. Fifth Element does that also. And there's so many movies like that that reminded me of. And the scenes that you're describing, like I can picture Deckard walking into Sebastian's toy room and Pris sitting dressed as a toy.
Ah, so good.
Is a so gorgeous good. Shot.
Yeah.
There's plenty of those.
Right.
You have it in the background right now. I jokingly said to my friend, I wonder who that Asian actress is, and I wonder if she got paid, and I wonder if she is like still getting residuals for being like the constant image of Blade Runner. the one who's on the ad selling Coca-Cola. And I'm
Right.
like, because that is like one of the lasting images of this movie is that it's this like future rainy hellish cityscape, but there is capitalism because there's advertising for brands, and there's this Asian woman selling Coca-Cola, and I'm like, I wonder who that actress was, if she was just a random model who was picked for this,
Right.
because her face is like the iconic lasting image of Blade Runner for me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think in in 2049, that's Anna de Armas, right? Is like the
virtual kind of thing, right?
The virtual
the
commercial
hologram.
Yeah. And I think that in and of itself is such a lasting image. And it's just something in the background. And it's like movies today, I think about movies being made today and how, oh, well, we'll just hire somebody to throw something up digitally in the background.
Yeah.
And, for this movie, in movies that came out in this era, you have matte painting artists, you have miniature artists, you have, the production design team, the art direction team, what they must have gone through. It's really crazy, like, to think about, like, this movie has vehicles in the street that feel like they're out of a Star Wars movie, but they weren't yet.
Yeah.
There's parts of this movie that feel like RoboCop, and RoboCop was still 5 years away. And it's just so, again, I want to make it very clear. While I don't love the concept of sitting down and watching Blade Runner from beginning to end, I have just this week gained a brand new appreciation and respect for the movie. It's to a point where I feel like if somebody asked me, what are your top 5 favorite science fiction movies of all time? Well, Blade Runner's not making that list. It's not even going to be in my top 15 or 20. But if they said, what are the greatest science fiction movies of all time, then I would have to include Blade Runner, because part of what makes, and I think you were making this point earlier, part of what makes a movie great is its lasting legacy. And you cannot deny that about Blade Runner. Whether I want to sit down for 2 hours and watch it straight through versus, like we just did, checking off a list of names, a list of like great sci-fi movies that we love to watch that all borrowed from this. So like this and 2001 and Alien would be on my list of the greatest science fiction movies of all time. Would they be number one? I don't know. It would probably have to be, of those 3 movies, Alien is my favorite to watch straight through.
Right. Yeah. And I would probably say the same for myself, even though I really do like Blade Runner a lot. You brought up this you started to get my mind going, man. You brought up this point about like audiences today and like the way that movies are made today, right? With the background and like digital backgrounds and stuff like that. And that's something I started to think about a lot. I started thinking about how the way that we approach film discourse, the way that people talk about movies, sometimes even on this channel, I think a lot of times, because it's all based on like YouTube and getting people to watch your videos, and it's based on the thumbnail and the title of your video, very, very frequently people talk about the plot holes, the flaws, things that are wrong with the movie to draw people in, right? Because they're like, oh, okay, I remember those plot holes. And, you shared a video with me last week by Cody Leach, right? Where he was talking about Trap, right? And I saw Trap with my mom. That sounds really lame, but I saw it with my mom, and I fucking sat and watched that review of Trap by Cody Leach with my mom because I liked his review so much. And my mom kept like laughing and stuff and like pointing and being like, yeah, that was me. Yeah. Like she got all of his points. And I think that film discourse nowadays, especially because of YouTube, maybe because of podcasts too, and just internet articles, there's such a focus on like plot and characters, and that like it doesn't seem like film audiences can like really be into like just the visual aspects of things, or like meandering things.
Aesthetics.
It's aesthetics. Like aesthetics don't have as much value as like plot and character.
I
To
feel
my
like there are as I've watched more movies and as I continue to watch more movies, I've started to appreciate more like certain directors who have certain visual styles where, like we talked about it with Shyamalan, where he has some movies that we absolutely love and he has some movies that we absolutely think are terrible.
yeah.
But there's something that when you watch an M. Night Shyamalan movie, you just know this is an M. Night Shyamalan movie. And
Yeah.
when a director has that, I think it does tend to elevate your viewing experience, where you could watch a Ridley Scott movie and appreciate it for certain things,
Yeah.
even though you don't love the whole movie. And I feel
Mm.
like that is you brought up Sherry and not loving Ridley Scott, and I feel like I'm very similar. I love some of his movies. Some of his other movies I can't stand, but I always find something. Napoleon, I did not like Napoleon whatsoever. But I really, the battle sequences, the scope and the epicness of the battle sequences, very similar for Kingdom of Heaven, which had its own disastrous making of. And there's a director's cut that's near 3 hours that I've never sat through completely, that I've been told is way better than the theatrical cut, which is slow and boring, and characters come and go and disappear.
Yes.
But then there's great moments in Kingdom of Heaven. I just rewatched Gladiator with my summer school class, and the movie is fucking great. It's this epic fucking movie.
Yeah.
And so it's like there's always something to take from a Ridley Scott movie.
Right.
And I think that you're right, that there's this idea today that if you don't love a movie 100%, the movie sucked. And if you don't love a movie 100%, you have to rip the shit out of it. And you have to, kind of rip it to shreds. Whereas I think there is a nuance to movies where you can say, I respect the hell out of this movie and I like these aspects of it, but it wasn't great in these parts. And like, I know personally, I grew up and I became a film fan. I went from liking movies to loving film in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, because of heavy dialogue, heavy character movies.
Yeah.
It might be the most film bro thing to say, but it was Tarantino and it was Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
Like movies like Clerks and Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs changed for me the way I watch movies.
Right.
And so I'm always going to be preferential to movies that have characters that I can get behind, characters that I get engrossed in their stories, and great dialogue.
Right.
And so when I see a movie that is more of a aesthetics piece, it doesn't always connect with me. A movie that I saw this year that I would recommend to everyone is I Saw the TV Glow.
Okay.
Was it my favorite movie of the year? No. Do I have tons of questions about it? And do I think it was kind of weird and oddly put together? Yes. But it's such a bizarrely unique movie aesthetically that I highly recommend it. So I feel like Blade Runner is that kind of movie for me, just to kind of bring it back where I value the aesthetic pieces of it, the art direction, the paintings, the miniatures, the score, the visuals, the lighting, and all of those things. I just wish it had more of those character elements that make me love movies.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get it. I get it. And it's funny because like I think when people talk about Ridley Scott as a director, they usually think of two movies as Ridley Scott movies. I know he's done Gladiator, Thelma and Louise, and I mean a shit ton of other movies, right? I mean, he just keeps putting them out. He's so old. But the two movies I
Gladiator
think
2 coming out later this year.
right, right. But I think the two movies that are synonymous with Ridley Scott are Alien and Blade Runner. And they're two very different stories where one is this like successful iconic movie and then one movie is praised as this like visually amazing movie, but it's not necessarily loved by everyone, right? And so I think that with Ridley Scott, it really matters on who's on his team. I mean, he had Giger and Dan O'Bannon and all the people involved in Alien, and of course the cast in both of these movies. There's amazing cast in both movies, right? If you look at the behind the scenes, I've had this ticker going across the screen for like 10 minutes, but I wanted to talk about this. The screenplay is written by two guys. They adapted Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. You got David Peoples, who co-wrote or wrote Unforgiven, 12 Monkeys. I fucking love 12 Monkeys. Peoples also co-wrote the movie Leviathan, which is sort of a B horror movie, but I actually really like Leviathan a lot.
I think I rented Leviathan more than any other movie as a kid. I love that movie. Go. It's basically what if Alien and The Thing got married and had a baby underwater.
Yep. That's your fucking movie right there, man. He also wrote the movie Soldier, which it's not like officially said, but like I think he said that it takes place in the world of Blade Runner. Because in Blade Runner, there's a lot of references to like being off-world or like on the off-world colonies. So that's that movie Soldier with Kurt Russell. Then, like I said, this movie's co-written by two guys. The other one is Hampton Fancher, and he's the one that wrote Blade Runner 2049. So these guys were involved in this whole process, and they took this iconic book by Philip K. Dick, he's one of those authors where, I mean, obviously he's not at the level of Stephen King, who has so many fucking adaptations, but quite a few Philip K. Dick books have been turned into movies.
Oh, I got it wrong. I was going to say, I was thinking of I, Robot is based on an Asimov. Yeah. But I, Robot reminded me also of Blade Runner in the sense that you have like this future cop chasing after a robotic humanoid to uncover some like great conspiracy. I love iRobot. That's one of my favorite sci-fi movies also.
I wish that I had, I should have done a little bit more research. I was really fucking busy, but I know like there's multiple movies that have been made into, multiple books that have been made into movies for Philip K. Dick. Obviously the most obvious one is this, but then there's also Total Recall, right?
Total Recall, Scanner Darkly.
A Scanner Darkly, or that Richard Linklater movie. This movie Paycheck, by Ben Affleck is in it.
Yeah.
Minority Report is Philip K. Dick.
Oh, yes. I fucking love Minority Report's another one that it feels like this, like it was totally inspired. Could be in the same universe as Blade Runner.
Right. And so, I mean, like Philip K. Dick, obviously there's some kind of source there that like people love to go to the well and draw from. I'm sure there's other examples of what I'm saying here, but like, I personally really do love this movie, and I don't have a difficult time rewatching it, except for the interactions between Deckard and Rachel, where it feels a little forced. And that's where I feel like the Vangelis soundtrack is at its lowest point. The soundtrack is fantastic, but it's got this kind of saxophone noir thing going on when the two of them are interacting. And I always feel like it sounds like they're playing that song, Can't Take My Eyes Off of You. Yeah. But it's like a little right? But then just in general, I really enjoy this movie. I'd actually love for the people in our comments and stuff, the people that usually comment when we're talking about Interview with the Vampire and stuff like that, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, jump on here and tell us what y'all think about this movie.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add to this discussion, Danny, or do you think we kind of...
I just want to mention the book again because the book focuses The Future Was Now by Chris Nashawati. It's focusing on these 8 science fiction blockbusters that came out in 1982, and it makes me want to like rewatch all of them and like rank them on how I feel about them. So it's obviously The Thing and Blade Runner. It's Tron, Conan the Barbarian, Poltergeist, E.T., of course. And what's the ones I'm missing? Oh, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and The Road Warrior, Mad Max Part 2.
What a fucking
all of
year.
them within 2 months of each other. I just, the book is great. I think it's available on Amazon now. I think I've tapped out my Blade Runner discussion, but
you've reached your expiration date.
Yes, time to die.
Yes, there you go. Nice. Now a little dove's going to fly out of Danny's crotch over there, and the sun's going to come out. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and we will talk.